And he says, hold fast to the taqwa of Allah, because the Muslim is the one from whose hand and tongue people are safe. And the mu'min, the believer, is the one from whose harm people are safe. So the believer is somebody about whom people can feel safe that this person is not going to harm them. That is a quality of a believer. And then he quotes a saying of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. So I think many of you would have guessed that that previous quote about the quality of the Muslim and the quality of the believer is actually a quotation from a hadith, although he doesn't say Qala Rasulullah, but it's actually from a hadith. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, he quotes, says, Ittaqillaha bi ta'ati, have taqwa of Allah by obeying Him, and obey Allah through taqwa of Him. Umar radiallahu anhu said, take account of yourself before you are taken to account. Weigh yourselves up before you are weighed up. And this is of course reference to the scale. Right? So weigh yourselves up before you are weighed up, and adorn yourselves for the great presentation, the day when no secret will remain hidden. So the greatest presentation is of course the presentation of deeds and actions on the day of judgment. He talks about taqwa. Here, taqwa implies fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because Allah is always in your mind, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is always in your consciousness, and therefore it is fear of Allah, fear of wronging Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fear of offending Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fear of disobeying Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because you're constantly aware of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing what you are doing, watching what you are doing, hearing what you are saying, and so on. All right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so every time in the Quran, for example, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about وَكَانَ اللَّهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا, you know, Allah talks about His attribute that Allah is all seeing, all hearing, right? وَكَانَ اللَّهُ سَمِيعًا بَصِيرًا. Every time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions an attribute, كَانَ رَبُّكَ قَدِيرًا, your Lord is most powerful. Every time Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about His attribute of knowledge, and He says يَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the treachery of the eye. You know, when somebody is just betraying someone else with just a glance, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that, and He knows what the mind hides, what a person's conscious mind hides. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about knowing things that happen between people, when He says أَلَمْ تَرَ أَنَّ اللَّهَ يَعْلَمُ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ, do you not know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what is in the heavens and the earth? مَا يَكُونُ مِن نَجْوَى ثَلَاثَةٍ إِلَّا هُوَ رَابِعُهُم, there is no secret conversation, secret whispering between three people except that Allah is the fourth. وَلَا خَمْسَةٍ إِلَّا هُوَ سَادِسُهُم, or five people except that Allah is the sixth. وَلَا أَدْنَى مِن ذَلِكَ وَلَا أَكْثَرَ إِلَّا هُوَ مَعَهُمْ أَيْنَمَا كَانُوا, nor a conversation between lesser number or a greater number except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with them, إِلَّا هُوَ مَعَهُمْ أَيْنَمَا كَانُوا, except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with them wherever they are. All of these verses, and of course there are many ahadith along the same vein, that refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes of knowing, seeing, hearing, knowing our secrets. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is alimun bidati sudur, is often mentioned in the Quran. Allah knows what is in the hearts. All of these are really to cultivate within us taqwa, because taqwa is an awareness of those attributes. When we have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we are aware that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees all, knows all, hears all, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows our secrets, knows the little indiscretions that are in the depth of our minds, that we indulge in through our eyes. And aware of those attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is essentially an awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's presence. Right? So this idea that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with you wherever you are is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows all of the details of our actions and thoughts, as though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with them there and then. And that creates a certain fear. right? Because you have your creator, your sustainer, the one who will judge our actions on the day of judgment, knowing everything that you do, and now you're doing what you're doing, right? So that creates a certain fear. There's a fearfulness of making an error, making a mistake, getting it wrong, not getting it right, not doing it to the best of our ability, etc. That is taqwa in its essence, in its true spirit, in its true essence. Ulama sometimes define taqwa in terms of simple consequence, right? And the simple definition of taqwa in terms of consequence is that essentially what that produces, the end product of taqwa is abiding by the halal and avoiding the haram. So if a person is able to live by what Allah permits and avoid what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibits, then they have fulfilled the requirement of taqwa, because that's essentially the end product of taqwa. Because what it does is you're constantly conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knowing what you're doing. So you only do what Allah allows, right? You do something, you know Allah allows it, you do it. If Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't allow it, you don't do it. Why? Because, on what basis are you going to disobey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Then there is another aspect of taqwa that I find really interesting in the way he presents this, the way he goes into this conversation about taqwa, where he talks about taqwa, but then goes on to talk about our conduct with others. And he mentions the hadith, the Muslim is the person from whose hand and tongue people are safe. So it's as if for him, it's like the first thing he mentioned with reference to taqwa is fearing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in our conduct towards others. All right, because the assumption here, it's interesting because effectively what he's saying is, don't think that when you harm somebody else, you're harming that person, and somehow that's got nothing to do with your taqwa, and it's got nothing to do with Allah, and it's nothing to do with your accountability before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Effectively, you are violating the requirements of your taqwa. When you harm someone, you're causing harm to somebody who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects to have protection from you. Essentially, they have that protection from Allah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them that protection. And you're violating that protection by harming that person. These words are, of course, words of the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith in Tirmidhi and other narrators, in which the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever al-Muslimu man salima al-Muslimuna min lisanihi wa yadihi wal-mu'minu man aminahu an-nasu ala dima'ihim wa amwalihim, that the Muslim is the one whose tongue and hands people are safe from, and the believer is the one who people feel safe from in regards to their blood and their wealth.